Good afternoon. Today is April 12th, 2026, and this is Peter Milton. And today I will be presenting on the 1994 to 1995 Battle of Grozny and the role that Soviet doctrine on urban warfare led to the disastrous battle and its aftermath. Throughout history, many battles have been fought and won or lost based upon the tactics employed by both sides. Sometimes this leads to battles where one side may be able to claim victory, but they lose much in terms of manpower and material. This is called a Pyrrhic victory and often becomes just as devastating to the winner as a defeat would have been had the situations been reversed. The Battle of Grozny from 1994 to 1995 during the First Chechen War was one such battle, with it having become the largest and most deadly battle in Europe since the Second World War at the time when it was originally fought. The battle had a long-lasting impact on the region and showed the weakness of Soviet-Russian doctrine when it comes to urban warfare. This video will document the course of the Battle of Grozny, the tactics employed, why it showed the weaknesses of Soviet doctrine, and how it continues to affect Russian military doctrine even to Ukraine, to the modern Ukrainian war. First, let us begin with some background. The roots of the Chechen conflict go far back in history, and ever since the conquest of the Circassian tribes of the Caucasus Mountains in the late 1700s by the Russian Empire, the region of Chechnya was always an area of tension between the Russians and the native inhabitants of the land, who were collectively known as the Chechens. This in turn led to many rebellions against both the Russian and later Soviet governments. This pattern created lasting resentment between the two groups, and this reached their apex in 1943, where millions of Chechen civilians, under the false premise that they were supporting the invading Germans, were deported from Chechnya to the sparsely populated camps in Kazakhstan and Central Asia. Although they were allowed to return following the death of Joseph Stalin and the liberalization of the Soviet government, it did little to quell the already existing tensions. All of this simmered over in 1991 when, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Chechnya, under the leadership of Doskar Duraev, declared independence from the newly formed Russian Federation as the Chechen Republic of Eritrea, and they began to amass a large National Guard force from both local conscripts and from volunteers throughout the region. While the Russians were initially unable to prevent the cession of Chechnya due to a combination of political and military issues in the immediate aftermath, by 1993 they had pretty much unified under Boris Yeltsin, and they began to basically take plans to retake the cities. This would set the stage for what would become one of the most destructive battles since the end of the Second World War. The battle began on the 30th of December 1994, when Russian forces, having already surrounded the city in November following a failed coup attempt in Chechnya, began shelling of the city over the course of the night. On New Year's Eve, the main operations of the battle began when Russian forces, which mostly consisted of armored units and motorized rifle divisions, entered the city limits and began moving out, and we were expecting light resistance, as per information gathered by GRU, or Russian military intelligence. However, GRU's estimates were severely misunderstated, and this culminated in a disastrous attack. This was proven by the fact that almost as soon as most of the forces came into the city, they came under instant fire from Chechen ground units, who used RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenade launchers to slowly whittle down the Russian armored advance, and they also used urban guerrilla tactics to inflict massive casualties on the Russian forces, with some units, infamously the 81st Mechanized Rifle Brigade, losing up to 80% of their manpower in the initial assault. This forced the Russians Russians to tactically retreat from the city in the following days and began to regroup. During this period, they reformulated their strategies by allotting more different troops in, and they also brought in new forces, which included elite infantry units such as Spetsnaz and airborne units, and they resumed their assault on January 7th, 1995, to a similar result that they basically were heavily countered by Chechen forces. Over the next 2 months, the two sides would engage in brutal house-to-house fighting, with both sides using terror tactics and hostage-taking to intimidate each other on the psychological level, as well as using death squads to slowly whittle down troop numbers and inflict massive casualties. Over time, and despite taking massive casualties, the Russians were eventually able to gain the upper hand through the massive use of artillery, using helicopter assault in a form of combined arms warfare, and the use of flamethrowers to clear entrenched Chechen positions. By the 8th of February, 80% of Grozny was under their direct control, and by the 20th, the last major Chechen stronghold was firm. Sporadic fighting would continue throughout the year, but the city was largely under Russian control by the beginning of March, but at the cost of over 1,000 to 5,000 deaths and twice as many wounded or captured, with double the number on the Chechen side. The following is a few images from the Battle of Grozny and the way that it showcase it. Please note that while some of the images are rather graphic, it does show the clear brutality of the battle and the way that it affected sides on both the Chechens and Russians. In the aftermath of the Battle of Grozny, Russia was able to consolidate its position in Chechnya. However, the mass casualties and brutality of the battle hampered their morale and ultimately turned the Russian public against furthering the war in Chechnya. As a result, they resulted more towards a defensive posture that disincentivized offensive action. This would have consequences just a year later, when, following a surprise attack by Chechen forces, the Chechens were able to reclaim Grozny and expel the Russians from Chechnya for the time being. This would Russia's failure also to hold Chechnya later resulted in the Dagestan insurgency as well, that preoccupied it throughout the late 90s. This, however, would eventually change after the fall of after the dawn of the new millennium, when, after having re-emerged as a victor in Dagestan, redirected its focus back to Chechnya, and using similar tactics to the one they did to their first time, they were able to defeat the Chechens without much support. This case study highlights how Soviet doctrine ultimately did not work all that well when faced with an enemy that was more willing to adapt to the traditions. The Chechens knew the location of the terrain and how to use it to their advantage, and how the structurized approach that Russian doctrine has does not fail. After this battle, Russia was hesitant to relaunch in major military operations again until their 2014 annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in the aftermath. And also, they did try to use the similar tactics they used in Chechnya to Ukraine with disastrous consequences, kind of showing also that Russia does have a tendency to be slow when adapted to this doctrine. All in all, the Battle of Grozny is a case study of the dangers of relying too much on an established norm especially when facing an enemy that has been known to adapt based upon issues of things. My name is Peter Milton. I've been your host, and thank you again for watching my video.